We're learning the Sikha on Parshas Metzora and Chelek Chav Beis on page 81. The shir today is being learned Lila Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rab Menashe Koltman. Nach the Parshias wegen die Dinim von after in the Parsha this week, after the Parshias where the Torah describes and tells us the halachas of regarding a man, Zav and Ish Kitetzem Mimenu Shechva Zera. These are two seminal discharges regarding a man that are different, both Zav and Shechva Zera. And then a blood discharge, a woman menstruating, a Nida and a Zava, which are the two halachas depending on what time of the month this is in. So as the Torah Messiah in the Sefer Sedre, the Torah concludes at the end of the Parsha and says as follows: Zois Teiras Hazav. This is the halacha of the Zav. Va'asheteitze mimenu Shechva Zera Gomer. And then it says V'hadava bini dosa, V'hazav ezoivoi, Lazachar v'lanekeva Gomer. So the pasuk here is concluding that we just learned here the Teiras Hazav. So now Rashi explains what are the details that are mentioned here in this pasuk. Is Rashi of them mefarish? So Rashi explains as follows: Zois Teiras Hazav. The first thing the pasuk says that this is the halacha of the Zav. This is Baal Riya Achas. This refers to a Zav that had one discharge. Umau Teirasai. And what his halacha is, what applies to him. That's one halacha here. And then Vashateitze Mimenu Shechva Zera, the next part of the pasuk where it says that he had a discharge, a Shechva Zera. Harei hu kebal keri. So what the pasuk here is saying is that this Zav that had one discharge, so his halacha is similar to the Baal Keri, which is a Tameh Tumah Serev. The Baal Keri is also a discharge, which is a bit different than the Zav, but the Zav, his halacha of Tumah, of impurity, is similar to the impurity of the Baal Keri, which is only Tameh until that evening. Tumah Serev. Tameh just for one day. That's what the Torah means by the first 2 points here. Teiras Hazav, Va'asha Teitzem Mimenu Shechva Zera. So the Va'asha means that the Zav has the halacha of the one that had a discharge, a Shechva Zera, Tameh just for one day. Then Rashi says the continuation of the next pasuk where it says Va'hazav ezoivoi. What does this refer to? Baal Shtei Riyais. This refers to someone that had 2 discharges, or a Baal Shalish Riyais, or 3. Shetirasan Mufureshes Lamaila. Now the halacha regarding one with 2 or 3 discharges, that's it says explicitly before in the psukim. Whereas the halacha of the Teiras Hazav, the Baal Riya Achas, it has not been mentioned before in the parsha. Okay, that's Rashi. Learn the Mefarshim. So now the commentaries explain here as follows: As Rashi's hechrech to learn as Zois Teiras Hazav. What's forcing Rashi here to say that when the Torah begins with Zois Teiras Hazav, that what is this referring to? So this means Niti Teiras Hazav wegen welche es retzach frir in parsha. It's not referring to a halacha of the Zav which was already mentioned earlier in the parsha, because here Rashi is saying that it refers to the Zav that had one discharge and his tum is just for one night, for one day till the evening. That's a halacha of a Zav that was not mentioned earlier in the parsha, as you see in Rashi earlier in the parsha when it talks about the Zav. It only mentioned the Zav that had Shtei Riyais or Shalish Riyais, but not the one with Riya Achas. So no, Bal Riya Achas. So Rashi is saying that the Zois Teiras Hazav refers to the Zav that only had one Riya. Was Teirase wird erst gesagt in Pasuk da. So his halacha is only mentioned, according to what Rashi is saying, right here and now. And the way the Torah teaches us this to us is, Umahu Teirase, how do we know what his halacha of Tumah is? Ve'asher Teitzem Mimenu Shechva Zera. That we compare him to the one that has a discharge of Shechva Zera, that the Torah explained before that his tum is one night. So now the Torah is telling us that a discharge of a Zav, his tum is also one day until that night. So why is Rashi saying this? Why isn't Rashi saying that Zois Teiras Hazav does refer to something that we already learned before in the Parsha? Is von dem, was die Torah chazet iber, noch einmal in den Pasuk shela achrei zeh, v'hazav ezoivei, lazachar. Because we have a repetition. In the next Pasuk, there the Torah talks about again this halacha of the Zav, v'hazav ezoivei. So if the first time the Torah says Zois Teiras Hazav, it's referring to the halacha of the Zav that was mentioned earlier in the Parsha, so then why is it repeating it again afterwards when it says v'hazav ezoivei? So it must be that when the Torah says Zois Teiras Hazav asher teitzem mimenu shechva zera, the Torah is teaching us a new halacha about the Zav that we compare it to the tumah of a shechva zera that was not mentioned before in the parsha. The Rebbe learned Rashi, as the Rebbe concludes here. So therefore, the Mefarshim say, Rashi learns, as die zwei Psukim, Zeis Teires Hazov, und Hazov Ezoivai, reden wegen zwei Sugim. That the repetition here is speaking about two different categories. Aleph, the first category, Zeis Teires Hazov, red wegen Bari Achas. That speaks of the Zav, that there was one Riyah. Und das was the Pasuk tellt es eis von Zav Bechlal, and the fact that the Torah separates this from the halachas of the Zav that was mentioned earlier in the Parsha, and that will be mentioned in the next Pasuk where it says Zav Ezoivai, is Val Bal Riyah Achas at an under din. Because the one that had just one Riyah, he has a different halacha. And as the Pasuk here tells us, Mahu Teirasai, what is his halacha? From the Bal Riyah Achas, Hareu Kabal Keri. He has the same halacha of the Bal Keri that also had one discharge, and he's only tummy until that evening. Then, when the Torah repeats it in the next pasuk where it says Beis, the second point, V'Zav Ezoivai meint Baal Shtei Riyos, or Ubal Sholish Riyos, that refers to one that had two discharges or three. Shetirasan Mefureshes Lamaila, their halacha of impurity and so on was already mentioned explicitly earlier in the parsha. That's the pshat of the Rashi that the Mefarshim say. So the Rebbe will question over here this hechrich, this that Rashi says here, this pshat, that it doesn't fit into the simple flow in the psukim here. And therefore, the question here is, der Pirish, this explanation, as die zwei sugim in die zwei psukim da, that what are the two categories? The way it's divided here, in the repetition of the two psukim. Zenen, Bal Riyah Achas, in the first pasuk, Zeis Teires Hazav, is when there's one Riyah, Bal Shtei Riyos, so Bal Shalish Riyos. And then, in the second pasuk, it speaks about the Zav that had two or three Riyos. Hot kama v'kama shverikeiten b'derech hapshat. There's a few difficulties in the simple understanding of the pasuk. Weil, because as follows. Aleph number 1, Favos shteti teire from Bal Riyah Achas esht b'siyam asedra. Why does the Torah tell us here about the halacha of a Zav that saw the discharge just once at the end of the parsha here? Noch alle andere sugim. After it goes through all the various different halachas of various kinds of discharges regarding a man or a woman, and here at the end of the parsha, after all of this, nachem pasuk v'hizartem es bnei Yisrael mitumasam goyme, and also after the pasuk concludes after everything and says the Yidden should be separate from the impurity. After all of this, the Torah says a new thing, a new detail that it skips before, and that is the Zeis Teires Hazav, that it's similar to Shechva Zera, the one that saw a discharge just once. Onit frier. Why didn't the Torah say it earlier? By the dinim from Zav or the Balkeri. There where it says all the other halachas about the Zav or the Balkeri, the two different types of discharges by a man. Ubefrat, as is doch oich abal Riyah Achas. We're talking over here about the halacha of the man that had the first discharge, one discharge. You don't come to two riyas unless you first have one. So the Torah tells us the details of the halachas of 2 or 3 riyas, and it skips the halacha of the riyah achas that must have been there once you have shtei riyas. So why is the Torah skipping this? Another question, beis lefizekum tais. According to the way Rashi explains the psukim here, it comes out as follows: As medarf machalik zayin di verter zeis teiras litzdoden. We have to explain the term that it says here, zeis teiras. This is the halachas, and we have to explain this sort of in two opposite directions. And that is as follows: B'shaychis teiras hazav. When it says the first time the halacha of the zav meintes, what does the Torah mean by zeis teiras hazav? It means to say das folgende, the following. What's going to be said here? Was kommt später is Teires Hazav. What's going to be said right over here? This is the halacha of the Zav that we compare the Riyah Achas to the halacha of the Balkeri. And then in the next pasuk where it talks about and it says that this is the Torah of the woman that had a discharge or the man. So over there, main Zeis Torah is das Gesagte. Frier, Hamufareshes Lamaila. As Rashi says, over here, Teiras means not the following that will be said here, but it's referring to the halachis of the Nida and the Zav that was mentioned already earlier in the Pasuk. So why would Rashi explain the Pasuk in such a way that the term Zeis Teiras means the following and also means this is the Torah that what we have already said before? Gimel, the third question here is, Lefiza, according to Rashi's pshat here, is the siyum, the conclusion here, the sach hakol from the Friedige Parshias, the conclusion and when the Torah gives here the total of everything we learned before in the parsha here, in ganzen nit leiten seder in welches stein. it's not in the same order as it appears earlier in the psukim before. Parsha Zav is gekommen far ish kiteitzim mimenu shechva zera unnida. If you look earlier in the parsha, the Torah begins first with the halachis of the Zav, the halachas of a discharge by a man, whether 2 or 3 re'iyos, and then it says the halacha of the man that had a discharge of shechva zera, and then it says the halachas of the nida. That's the way it appears before. Far ish kiteitzim mimenu shechva zera unnida. The halachas of the man come regarding him being a Zav comes before the halachas regarding the man that had a discharge of shechva zera, and also before the halachas of the woman of a nida. But according to Rashi's pshat over here, state v'hazav ezayvay, when the pasuk says the second time hazav ezayvay, was loit Rashi meintes der zav was terasha mufareshes lamayla. According to Rashi, this refers to the halachas of zav regarding the man that I mentioned earlier. Noch v'hadav binidasa. Here the Torah is giving you the total and bringing this halacha of the man after mentioning the halachas of the woman being a nida that was earlier in the psukim. It was brought in the opposite order. So isn't it move on? So it's not understood here as follows. Halamai learned Rashi. Why? What would bring Rashi to say? Rashi only says what's the simplest in the understanding of the psukim. As the tzvei sugim, that when we see here the repetition, and we know that there has to be 2 types of zavin, and that's what the Torah says, Zayis Teiras Hazav, and then it says Hazav Zayve. So what brings Rashi to say that these 2 categories, Zenin, Baal Riachas, the first time it's referring to the one that had just 1 Riyah, and the second time, On Baal Shtei Riyas or Baal Shalosh Riyas, refers to the one that had 2 or 3 Riyas. And at Gedarft Lernen, wouldn't it be much simpler if Rashi would explain, Azayis Teiras Gaimer, is blois asach hakel from Friya. That Zayis Teiras is not coming now after it's all done to teach us a new detail that wasn't mentioned before. Zayis Teiras is just a conclusion and the sach hakel of everything that we already learned before. And therefore we would say as follows. Un Zayis Teiras hazav mein balshteiris. When it says Zayis Teiras, so the first time it refers to one that had two discharges. Un vazav ezayve, the repetition. The second time, balshalish riyas, one that had 3 discharges. Wie Rashi hat schon früher gebracht und Chiles Parsha Zav, als es einen Mecholokim zwischen sich. And as Rashi already explained before, that we can divide this into 2 different categories because they are divided in their halacha. Shtayim l'tumah, after 2 discharges, there's a halachas of impurity that apply, and vashlishis, but after 3, maskikasi l'karbon. Then in addition to the halachas of tumah, there's also a halacha that he must bring a carbon. So if Rashi is looking to explain the repetition of the psukim, instead of introducing a new halacha of the Re'iyah Achas that was not mentioned earlier, Rashi could have simply said that one is Shtei Riyas and one is Shalosh Riyas. And then it would be somewhat in the order of what the Torah said before. It's still not completely in the order of the way the Torah said it before, and the Rebbe clarifies here in the next paragraph. Und das, was die Torah stellt, den Prat von Zav Bal Shalosh Riyas, and the fact that the Torah divides the 2 categories of the Zav. There's the Zav of 2 Riyas and the Zav of 3 Riyas. And the fact that the Torah puts the halacha of the Zav of 3 Riyas, nit bim kaimai, far v'isha, far v'asher teitzem imenu gaimer. It doesn't put it in its place before the Torah mentions here the halacha of shechva zera, because again, earlier in the parsha, the halacha of the Baal Shtei Riyas and Shalosh Riyas were mentioned before the halacha of shechva zera. So why here does the Torah divide these 2 categories of Zav? No, it's Zamen mit Zava. It puts the halacha of the Zav that had 3 Riyas together with the woman, the Zava. So that could be explained. We can answer as follows. As das is, weil nor die zwei haben dem din miyuchad. Because it's only the Zava and the which is the woman, and the Zav, the man, that has 3 discharges, have a unique din. Was tellt sie aus von die alle andere Sugim da. And with this, they're different than all other categories mentioned here. As they darf haben a carbon, that they must bring a carbon. L'chaper of dem tumas haziva, to atone for this impurity of this ziva. So therefore, the Torah puts together the tumah of the zava and the tumah of the zav with 3 riyas because they are similar. But the zav of the shtei riyas is the first time the Torah says zayis Torah says zav, and it puts it before in the order of the way it appears earlier in the parsha here. That would be a much simpler pshat for Rashi to say here in the pasuk. Instead of saying that when the Torah says Zayis Torah Sazav, it's introducing a new halacha never mentioned before, the Zav that had 1 Riyah, and then it comes out that, as the Rebbe explained here, that the pasuk is not clear. Why is it now, after everything is done, introducing something new? And then the Zayis Torah says Litzdadin. You have to explain the Zayis Titus that over here it's saying something new that follows, not mentioned before. That's the question over here on what Rashi says. Rashi could have explained it much simpler. Okay, so now the Rebbe offers or suggests a pshat that could be said over here. So at first glance, we would be able to answer why Rashi is saying the pshat he does as Rashin, Arto, the Kefal Aloshin. That what's bothering Rashi here is the double expression that the pasuk says here, besides the redundancy mentioned before, that it starts off with Zayis Titus Hazav, and then afterwards it says Vahazav ez Zayvai, but there's also the redundancy in the word of Vahazav ez Zayvai. That's the one that has this flow of this discharge. Why does it use this double term? Nitvi in Friedigen pasuk, where it says Zayis Titus Hazav, wo the Lashon Zav steht bloi zemal. There it uses the term Zav just once. And from then named Rashi, it's from this that Rashi concludes, as the pasuk is Damer Ames of Tzvei Sugim in Zav, that the Torah here is coming and is hinting to us that there are two different categories of Zav. And then here the Rebbe points out that Rashi concludes from this distinction, that first earlier it says Zayis Titus Hazav, and now it says Vahazav Ezayvai with a double lashon. So the two categories that Rashi sees here in the lashonis of the psukim here is al derech v'Rashi ad frier upgelernt. This is similar to the source that Rashi learns from the language of the psukim. Then chiluk anal zwischen bal shteiris and bal shalosh. Where's the source of the two different categories of a zav when he has two discharges or three? It doesn't say it's spelled out in the actual pasuk. At least it doesn't seem so. But Rashi learns out that the Torah is talking about the bal shteiris and bal shalosh from where? From them kefel aloshen in the tzvei psukim dart. Rashi learns it in the beginning of the whole parsha about zav. So the psukim there's also redundancy. And Rashi there says, Mana kasav arishain riyestein. If you look in the first pasuk, when it brings the halachas of the zav, and the Rebbe will quote it later here in the Sikha, as we'll see. So there it says, shtayim, it says twice zav mipsarai, and then zayvai. So it says the term of the discharge, zav, twice. So that's the zav which had two discharges. And then amana kasav hasheni riyas shalish. In the next pasuk it says three times. B'zayvai, rar b'sarai ezayvai, hechtem b'sarai mizayvai. So the Torah uses the term zav three times, so we know that it's talking about three discharges. This is the source that Rashi said in the beginning of the parsha, that there's two zavs, the zav of the shtei riyos and the zav of the three riyos, all based on the amount of times that the Torah writes the words zav or zayvai. So similar over here, we could say that Rashi, the proof that Rashi has that the Torah here is speaking about first the zav that had one riyah, and then later on the zav that had shtei or shalish riyos, is from the lashonis of the psukim here, as the Rabbi spells out. As in die zwei psukim zusammen. So we have it divided in two different categories here. But in addition to that, we look here in the psukim, and in both psukim together, Verd gezog drei mal zav, we have the term zav mentioned three times. The Rebbe and Rashi, that's what brings Rashi to say, as Zayis Titus Hazav meint bal riachas, that the first time it's speaking about one kind of zav with one riyah, and vazav ezayvai, and then when it says that another two times is bal shtei riyos or bal shalosh riyos. That adds the two other zavs, which are either with two or three discharges. So it's based on the fact that we see here that it's divided into two categories, and the Torah writes the term zav three times, so we know that there are these three different kinds of zavim. That would be the source for what Rashi is saying here. However, the Rebbe says, shver azay zu lernen. It's difficult to explain that this is the source of Rashi. Because the redundancy of the pasuk when it says here v'hazav ez zayvai is nit as starke diuk b'derech hapshat. It's not really such a strong question in the simple understanding of the pasuk. Sizal derech, it's similar unochmes kumt behemshich to the kefal aloshen v'adava b'nidasa. It's similar, and you have right afterwards the pasuk here uses the double lashon regarding the woman, the nida that has a discharge v'adava b'nidasa, and there is no two different types that it speaks about. So there's no room to say, as Salibdem, Zol Rashi lernen, as a weiten pirish, that because of the redundancy of Vazav Azayvai, this should be the source of Rashi to bring a pshat which is so far. Sagen as das is pshat, it's far to say that this is simple in the meaning of the pasuk here in Zayis Teres Azav Asher Gaime. as explained before, that this is not a simple pshat in the pasuk. So just the redundancy of azav azayve is not enough of a reason to say that the Torah here is introducing a new zav, and therefore we have the ziriya achas, shtei riyos, shalish riyos. As you see by Dav Binidasa, Rashi doesn't say that it refers to two different things. In addition, another point there, even if we are to say, as the kefil aloshem v'azav azayvay is yad yikun derech hapshat, that this is something to stop on in the simple pshat of the pasuk, why it writes this double expression, is aber der oifen alimud. However, this way to explain this, as the kefil aloshem is merames of tzvei sugim, that the fact that the Torah is writing this redundancy, and therefore we come to the conclusion that the Torah is hinting here to two different categories of zav, is not ayin shel medrash. This is not simple pshat of the pasuk. This could be classified as a medrash, as a drash, expounding the pasuk to teach us this, but it's not simple pshat. And here again, the Rebbe references back to where Rashi said similar, as quoted before. In the beginning of the Pasha, the redundancy of the terms Zav and Zayvai, and there Rashi did use that as a source for the Shtei Riyos and Shalish Riyos, but there though Rashi says that it's Medrash. Rashi sagt frier. So earlier there, Rashi says, beim Chelek zwischen Shtei Riyos and Shalish Riyos, was man lernt ab von Mana Kasav Riyos Shtayim, Riyos Shalish, when the Torah there writes the terms Zav and Zayvai, and Rashi learns from there, as quoted before, the 2 or 3 different Riyos, as das is nicht pshutai. Rashi does not say that this is pshat, nor medrashay. Rashi says that it's just a medrash. Hat Rashi euch da gedacht madgish sein, as ein pirish is medrashay. So here, if the source of what Rashi is saying is just the redundancy of the term zav and zayvai, Rashi should have pointed out that this is a medrash. And he doesn't. So there has to be another clearer source in the simple pshat of the pasuk here for the pshat that Rashi says. Okay, so the point over here is the Rebbe wants to explain what is the reason why Rashi is saying something which is seemingly not the simple pshat of the pasuk. Yeah, we do have a redundancy here. It says Teiris Azav, then it says Azav Azayvai, but Rashi could have simply said that Teiris Azav refers to the Zav with Shtei Riyos, and Zav Azayvai refers to the Zav with Shalish Riyos. Simple. And that's what was mentioned already earlier in the parsha here. Instead, Rashi says, no, Teiris Azav refers to the one, and it's a new point that the Torah is teaching now, that it refers to the Zav that had 1 Riyah, and then Zav Azayvai, it refers to the one that had Shtei Riyos and Shalish Riyos. Why is the Torah doing that? Or why is Rashi, that is, explaining the pasuk in this way? So we can answer this and explain as follows. The Lashon Zayis Teiris Azav, when the Torah uses this expression, this is the Torah of the Zav, is al derech Zayis Teiris ha'ela gaimer hamincha v'gaimer, similar to what we find earlier in the Torah, Parshas Tzav, I believe it is, where the Torah says, this is the halachas of the Karban Oila, this is the halachas of the mincha that you bring in the Beis HaMikdash, which means what? Meint alle oilas minchas v'chulu. The Torah there is saying halachas that apply to all oilas and to all minchas, alle sugim, including all categories. So the same expression that the Torah uses here, Zayis Teiris Azav, Rashi. So from this, Rashi learns and Rashi explains, as da is the Torah kailal und will mefaret sein alle suge zav. The Torah here includes and is letting you know all the details of all types of zav, vala seder. And another detail is that the Torah is telling this to you in a certain order as well, and that is menakal elachomer, telling you the halacha of the tumah of a zav, a lighter level of tumah, and then coming to a more severe level of tumah. That's the meaning of when the Torah uses this expression of Zayis Teiras. Zayis Teiras means this is all inclusive, all the halachas, all the details, and in a proper order of menakal elachomer. That's the basis of this Rashi here. Now, based on this, so the first point here is as follows: why the Torah, when it speaks about the halacha of the tumah of the zav for the man, for the zachar, nit wo es retzich wegen zav frier in parsha. It doesn't say it before where it speaks in the same order that it does, like earlier in the parsha where the zav comes first. No mitvalan keva, zav zusammen mit zava. The Torah puts the halacha of the zav zayvai together with the nekeva, the zava. The reason is they haven't baited themselves in chaymer, because the Torah here is setting it up zayis teiras in a seder menakal alachomer. So when it speaks about the level of the zav, which is a Baal Shteiris and Baal Shalishis, which is more stringent, similar to the Zava, so therefore it puts the Zacha and the Nekeva together. Okay, but now the Rebbe will explain, coming back here to the Zois Tairas, when Rashi says that the Torah here is introducing a new Zov, and that's the Zov Baria Achas. So if we're saying that the Torah wants to include everything, and the Torah is including everything in an order of Menakal Lachomor, so now the question is, Da steht doch frie Torah Hazov. Far vashe teitze mimenu goimer. The Torah writes over here the halacha of the Zov. Before it says the halacha of vashe teitze mimenu. Vashe teitze mimenu refers to the Shichva Zera. Vasher b'teis v'zvav. And it writes Vasher, adding a Vav, was beweist as Hazov da is oicha prat in klolus hasug von Zov. So therefore when it says over here the halachas of the Zov, what we see over here is we're talking about a certain detail about the Zov that's in the general category of a Zov. Darf the Fiza is coming as is da Zov velches kal bedinoi from vashe teitze geimer. So that must mean that the Torah, which is setting this up for us, Dois Teiras, Minakal ala Chamor, so when it says Zois Teiras Hazav in the beginning, it must be talking about a halacha of Tumah relating to a Zav, which is actually a certain detail of the general halachas of the Zav that is a lighter Tumah than the Tumah of Asher Teitzim Mimenu, the Shichva Zera. But the question is, how could that be? Und wie bald, das wir kennen sagen, als Zav bal shtei Ries, soll sein gleich. Since it's impossible to say that the Zav that had 2 discharges should be the same, or even a lighter tumah than the one that saw Shichva Zera, because as explained before, the one the halacha is that one that sees the shtei, that's a much greater tumah. That's a tumah where you're tumah for 7 days. The one that sees the Shichva Zera, as mentioned before, is only a tumas erev, till that night. So if the Torah before Shichva Zera brings the halacha of Zois Teiras Hazav, which is including must be including another halacha of Zav that's a lighter tumah, or at least the same as Shichva Zera. It's not starting off with Teiras Hazav, which is more chamor, more stringent, and then coming back to Shichva Zera, which is lighter. So therefore, that's what forces Rashi to say, Muzmin Zogen Azois Teiras Hazav meint bal riachas. Therefore, Rashi concludes that Zois Teiras Hazav in fact does refer to a Zav that only had 1 discharge, and therefore his halacha is the same as Shichva Zera, so the Torah is going in an order. It's starting off with the halacha of the Zav Baria Achas, and then the Shichva Zera. Both of them are the lightest tumah, which is only tumas erev, tumah till that evening. Then it goes on to categorize the tumah of the Zava and the Zav Bal Shtei Riyos, which have a tumah for 7 days, and even a tumah that requires a carbon. So this is the pshat over here in the Rashi. That's why Rashi is including a new, that he says that the pshat in the pasuk is that it's including over here a new halacha that was never mentioned before, even though in the simple pshat of the pasuk it seems to be a squeeze. But we must say so because that is what Zois Teiras Hazav means. Zois Teiras Hazav is we're going to include now all the halachas of Zav and in the order of Menakal Lakovit or Menakal Lachomer, which brings Rashi to this conclusion. Okay, but now here though, in the continuation, the Rebbe will focus on the second category of Hazav as Zoivoi, which Rashi says refers to the Zav Bal Shtei Riyos and Zav Bal Shalosh Riyos that Rashi says are Mefurashis L'mayla. It was already mentioned explicitly before. So here the Rebbe will get into more details to look at what it said before. Was it actually explicitly mentioned before? So here the question is, Medafa b'fashtein v'as Rashi zogt v'hazav as Zoivoi Bal Shtei Riyos and Bal Shalosh Riyos shetirasan Mefureshes L'mayla. So Rashi says we have these 2 kinds of Zav, the 2 or 3 Riyos, and their halachas are mentioned clearly before. So now, from the Rashi, from the exact words that Rashi says here, Bal Shtei Riyos or Bal Shalosh Riyos, that we have 2 categories. One is with the 2 Riyos, the other is with the 3. Shetirasan, and their halachas, plural, both of them separately, Mufureshes L'mayla is explicitly mentioned before. So from Rashi using this expression is muchach, it's clear, as leit Rashi ret the pasuk v'azav ezoivoi v'egen tzvei sugi zav, that the pasuk here is including these 2 different categories of the zav that Rashi very clearly divides, the 2 and the 3 riyos that have separate halachas. As mentioned before, the Bal Shtei Riyos is tummy 7 days, but no carbon required. And then when it comes to the Bal Shalosh Riyos, it requires a carbon as well. And Rashi says this is Mufurashis L'mayla. The Torah said this clearly earlier. Is nit move on, so it's not understood here. Der Bier Anal Siv Daled is bloiz a hechrech as Zois Teiras Hazav ret again, sorry, is blaze hechrech as dois teres hazav red wegen bal ria achas und va hazav azoivoi wegen hazav was es chamor was teitze mimene goime und va dove benidasa. So what we see from the lashon of Rashi, that from the way Rashi explains the pasuk, we must say that the Torah here is dividing the zav into two different categories. One is Zayis Teres Hazav, which is the lighter zav. The Torah begins with that, Kal, and then it speaks later about the Chomer, Teitze Mimenu, which is similar to David ben Idasa when there was two Riyas. Aber from Vanet is the Hechrech, from Pashtus Aksuvim Da. What forces us to say from the psukim over here, as Vazav as Zoivoi is Kailol Tzvei Sugim? That over here when it says Vazav as Zoivoi, it includes two different categories, Baal Shtei Riyos, or Baal Shalosh Riyos. It includes both the Zav with two Riyos and the Zav with three Riyos. So why? So we. Here the Rebbe is asking sort of a little bit of a different question that we asked before. Before in the Sikha, the Rebbe asked that Rashi could have said that the pasuk is talking about the Baal Riyah Achas. The Rebbe before asked that the pasuk we could have divided the two categories as by the Zav of the Shtei Riyos and the Zav of the Shalosh Riyos. Okay, so that the Rebbe explained that we must say when it says Zayis Teres Hazav, it's talking about the Zav of a Riyah Achas, because only then we understand how the Torah begins with the lighter Tumah, similar to Shechva Zera, and the Torah goes in the order of Kal Chomer. But the question now becomes, though, Benegay to Zav as Zoivoi, here the Torah is talking about a stringent Zav, a severe Zav, which is similar to the halacha of the Zava, but we could simply say that it refers to the Zav Bal Shtei Riyos. And mitzad, the psukim over here, l'chayra, there's no hechrech to say that it includes the Baal Shalosh Riyos as well. Now, l'chayra came in, so seemingly what we have to say, the answer for this is, as we bald, Rashi hat schon früher gebracht. Akol panem als medrash. Rashi already quoted in the beginning of the whole parsha here, as a medrash. As is an efarant, svei sugi zav, that there are two different categories of a zav, shtei riyos and shalosh riyos, with two or three riyos. Is mefared da nachamol tzvei sugim. So here, when the Torah says Zayis Teiras, and it includes all the details, so Rashi includes again the two categories that were mentioned earlier. So when Rashi here says that this is the Baal Shtei Riyos, the Baal Shalosh Riyos, that their halachas are explicitly mentioned before, there is no hechrech in the pasuk here, in the lashon of the pasuk here, Vazav Zoivai. Nothing is forcing us to say that it's including both. But because it says Vazav Zoivai and it's referencing what the Torah said earlier, and earlier in the parsha it does mention both Shtei and Shalosh Riyos, so therefore Rashi says when it says there Vazav Zoivai, it includes those two categories mentioned earlier. That's l'chayra the pshari, but there's no actual hechrech from what the pasuk, the language of the pasuk here. Aber, however, with this pshat though, as is nidglatik lashon Rashi, what Rashi here says is not smooth, because Rashi's lashon is shetirasan mufureshes lamayla, that the halacha of the shtei riyos and the shalosh riyos, where are we taking this from? This is explicitly mentioned earlier. Azayir dinim, that these two kinds of zavin and their halachas. The difference that there are between them, one requires a carbon, one does not, as mentioned before, is mufureshes lamaila. It's explicitly mentioned earlier in the parsha. But the question is, how could Rashi say this? What should be said here is teirasa nidreshes lamaila, that the difference in their halachis, there is a drasha from the pasuk earlier to imply this. Virashi alein zak lamaila. As Rashi himself earlier, as quoted before, says, as the chiluk zwischen shtei riyos v'shalosh riyos is nit pshute from the psukim. It's actually not in the simple pshat of the pasuk there, nor midrashay. It's just a medrash that Rashi expounds from the redundancy of the words zav, zoivai. It says it in one pasuk twice, in another pasuk 3 times, and from that we divide that there's the Baal Shtei Riyos and the Baal Shalosh Riyos. But as Rashi before clearly said, it's just a medrash. So if Rashi here brings again the Baal Shtei Riyos and the Baal Shalosh Riyos, and his whole hechrech to bring it is not from what Rashi says here. Rather, it's from the way it was mentioned earlier in the parsha, and this is the sachakol of everything mentioned earlier, so Rashi brings it here. But if so, Rashi shouldn't have used this expression of mufureshes lamayla. It's not mufureshes. It's only nidreshes. It's a drash. So here, the Rebbe will explain that, in fact, if you go back to what the psukim say before, even though Rashi does use the term medrash, but nevertheless, it is mufureshes. You can see clearly from the pshat of the pasuk earlier that there's two different categories: the zav bal shtei riyos and then the zav bal shalosh riyos. Is the beer in them? So the answer here is as follows: Das was Rashi früher bringt medrashay. The fact that Rashi before says in the source of the two categories of Zav, Shtei Riyes and Shalosh Riyes. And Rashi uses the term that it's just a medrash. Sorry. Is a snit wie in andere Erte. The term medrash used there is not similar to the way it is in other places. Vu loit medrashai is der pirish in pasik anders wie loit pshutai. The explanation of the medrash gives us a whole different approach, a whole different understanding of the pasuk, different than the simple pshat of the pasuk. No, beniden di done. Rather, in our case, is oich loit medrashai is the pirish and pasik v'loit pshutai. Even after Rashi points out the medrash of the redundancy of the words zav and zayvai, what Rashi takes from this drash of the redundancy of those words is explaining the simple pshat of the pasik. Medrashai geht beikir oif und meisif nach an inyan was is merumas in pasik. The term medrasha that Rashi uses is just a term that Rashi is referencing to and adding another detail that this also explains the redundancy of the words zav and zayvai. But in fact, this medrash that Rashi explains regarding those words is also explaining the simple pshat of the psukim here. On the other hand, is the drash nitna miyashiv dem pshat. The drash over here is not just something which settles or answers a certain question that there would be on the simple pshat of the pasuk, but taking it to a whole different pshat that's not the simple pshat of the pasuk. That's not the case. Nor muchrich loit pshutai. It's something which we're forced to learn in the simple reading of the psukim here. While dafke loiten drash, because it's only according to this drash that Rashi takes on the redundancy of the words of zav and zayvai, baloshen Rashi, an expression that Rashi uses elsewhere, agode liyashiv pshuta shel mikra. This is a drash, an agode, but it explains the simple pshat of the pasuk. Vert ve'emfit e'arichis loshen pasuk was a shver loit pshutay. It explains the lengthy words of the pasuk, which is simply difficult. Besides the redundancy of the words of zav and zayve, which is the drash aspect that Rashi says, but besides that, the simple pshat of the psukim that it says in the beginning of the parsha here are difficult to understand. And here the Rebbe quotes the psukim, and we'll see how there's something here in the simple pshat of the psukim that is out of order, that therefore forces us to say this drash. Frie stein zwei psukim. What does it say over here earlier? In the beginning of the whole parsha of the zav and the zava. So right in the beginning there are two psukim. First pasuk says, Ish kiyeh zav mipsarai zayvai tamehu. Person that has the discharge, he'll be tameh. The next pasuk, v'zayis tia tumasai b'zayvai, rar b'sarei azayvai, oy hechten b'sarei mizayvai, tumasaihi. So then the Torah goes on to say, so this person has a discharge, and then the Torah says, v'zayis tia tumasai. And when he has this discharge, this will be his tumah. But then the Torah sort of goes back again and says, b'zayvai, rar b'sarei azayvai, hechten b'sarei mizayvai, tumasaihi. And then in the pasuk shela achrei, in the following pasuk, there it says actually the details of the impurity that apply to this zav, what he lies on, and so on. So we right away see over here that there's something out of order in the psukim. Is nit verstandig. What's not understood is as follows. Favas is the Torah mafsik tzvishin v'zayis tumasai b'zayvai. When the Torah in the second pasuk begins with v'zayis tia tumasai, this is the tumah of the zav. On the dinei tumah kol mishka v'goyme, and to actually say the details of what the halachas of the tumah is, mitiverte, with the word that it goes back to describing the actual discharge itself, rar b'sarei gaimer, or hechten b'sarei gaimer, which are two types of discharges, but zanenit dinim in tumas hazav. These are not details of the halachas of the impurity of the zav. Two different types of discharges. As Rashi there explains, rar b'sarei means rir sheyetzit salol, hechten b'sarei means sheyetza of v'saisim espia ama. Two different types of discharges, the thickness of it. So why would the Torah describe the actual discharge in the second pasuk after this second pasuk begins with v'zayis tia tumasai, where it's seemingly coming to tell you not the actual discharge itself, but the tumah, the halachas of tumah that apply to this discharge. The verte rar b'sarei ezayvai or hechten b'sarei mezayvai, these words where it describes the actual discharge itself, have melachayre gedaft stein in dem friedigen pasuk. The place of this would be in the previous pasuk, and it should say as follows: Ish ki zav mipsarei, as the first pasuk here begins, and then it should add describing this discharge itself. Rar b'sarei azayvai, I hechte b'sarei mizayvai, zayvai tamihu, and then it would continue. V'zai tia tumasai, this is the halachas of the tumah, and immediately say, kol mishkav gaimer, when he lies and he sits and so on, without the interruption after the words v'zai tia tumasai, with the description of the actual discharge itself. That's difficult here in the simple pshat of these two psukim, the way it's set up. Of them kommt medrashay verempfet, and therefore Rashi brings here what we have, the medrash that focuses on explaining the redundancy of the terms zav and zayvai, and this medrash will explain also the simple pshat of the pasuk that mana kasav erishayin v'kareh tameh. There's what's counted in the first pasuk, and the first pasuk concludes the word tameh. And Akasav Hasheni, then you have the second pasuk v'kareh tameh, and it says in the second pasuk also that he's tameh, because it's speaking about two different tumas. The Torah is the mitmeram is of zwei sugim in zav. The Torah here is hinting to the fact that there's two different categories of zav. But their tumah is nit gleich, and therefore their tumah is not the same. And the far stehen sie in zwei besondere psukim, and therefore they're written in two different psukim. Hakasav Erishain, Hakasav Hasheni, the first pasuk, the second pasuk. Und jeden für sie besonder kareh tameh. And the Torah, by each one, uses the term tameh again to define and give it and call it and give it the name tumah for each one separately. Vibal their tumah is nit gleich, since their tumah is not the same. Was then die zwei sugi zav und wo is the chiluk b'neihem rumiz im pasuk? What are these two categories of the zav? What divides them in reality? What is the difference in the mitzias between them? And where is this hinted in the lashon of the pasuk? So Zogt Rashi, on this Rashi brings a medrash, as jede zoiv was wert der Mont im pasuk is meram as if noch hariyah. But you have to look at the amount of times that the term zoiv is written in the pasuk, and that refers to another riyah. So in the first pasuk it says it twice, so it's two discharges, and in the second pasuk 3 times. Ubemele ret der kasav erishayin wegen eine was hat gesehen riyah shtayim. So the first pasuk is speaking about one that had 2 discharges, and kasav hasheni wegen eine was hat gesehen riyah shalish. In the second pasuk where it says the term zoivai 3 times, it's talking about one that had 3 discharges. So what comes out from all of this? Kumtais as pshutei shal mikra dartin is machriach, that there in the beginning of the whole parsha here, the simple pshat of the way the two psukim are set up forces us to say as medarv darshanin dem yitra lashon, that over here the redundancy of the term zoivai has to be expounded and explained. Ubemele as is then dot svei sugim and zav, and that explains us the simple pshat of the way these two psukim are set up, and that there's 2 categories of zav. But that's the bal shtei riyos on bal shalish riyos, the 2 and the 3 different riyos. That is the simple pshat of why Rashi says shetirasan mufureshes lamayla. Even though Rashi there said it's a medrash, but this is a medrash that's explaining the simple pshat of the pasuk in the beginning, the 2 psukim. Okay, so now over here, the Rebbe explains that this is the Baal Shtei Riyos and the Baal Sholosh Riyos that Rashi is talking about over here. The Rebbe comes back now to the way that Rashi explains the pasuk of Hazav Ezayvei over here. Bald as der medrash beniden die don is azab was is muchrech mitzat pshute kanal. Here the medrash that Rashi explained earlier, the 2 different types of zaven, is a medrash which we're forced to say this in the simple pshat of the psukim. Is verstandig, so from this we understand as euch der chiluk in din zwischen sei. So also not only the fact that there are 2 categories, but also the fact that they have 2 different halachas. Was Rashi bringt, as Rashi brings it earlier, shtayim l'tumeh Vashlishis maski kosel carbon, that after 2 riyos there's halachas of impurity that applies for 7 days, and then if it's 3 riyos, so then you have to bring a carbon. Is nid blois hatakas lashon Chazal. Rashi is not just simply quoting the lashon that Chazal say regarding the halachas of these 2 different categories of anida, of the zav, that is. Velche is nit hepech hapshat. Rashi is bringing it because it's not the opposite of the simple understanding of the pasuk. No, it says muchrech im pshute shel mikra. Also, these halachas, the fact that the difference between them, you may say maybe the difference between them relates to some other details, but no. Rashi says the difference between them is that one is the zav is for tumah 7 days, and the other one, the halacha is that its tumah is a kind of tumah that requires a carbon, a different thing, carbon. Where in Pshuta Shel Mikra, if Rashi says Teirasal Mefureshes Lamayla, so what that means is that the specific halachas of Shtei Riyos and Shalish Riyos forces us to say that we have different halachas that And those different halachas of the tumah and the carbon is also mufareshes lamayla. Where are these details of carbon versus tumah mufareshes lamayla? That's what the Rebbe will explain now. So the explanation here is as follows. When the Torah uses the term V'zayis tia tumasai, but tzitzich bepashtes zu dem tomehu v'steht in friedigen pasik. So this term v'zayis tia tumasai is a continuation. In the simple pshat of the pasik, it's following what the pasik said before tomehu v'steht in friedigen pasik, which was mentioned in the earlier pasik by Baal Shtei Riyos, when it says the halacha of the zav that had only 2 riyos. Darf mezagin, if so, we must say as the dine tumah. As far as the actual halachas of the tumah is concerned, which will be mentioned in the continuation of the parsha, the halachas of the tumah is the same. Because again, in the first pasuk it says tamehu, and then it continues v'zois tia tumasai, and the title later goes on to say the halachas of the tumah regarding mishkav and moishav and so on. So as far as the flow in the halashon of the pasuk, it's clear that the tumah halacha is the same. The halachas of lying and sitting and so on, that's all the same. So if so, on the other hand though, this is 2 different categories of tumah, and they have different halachas. What is the difference in the halachas between them? Muzman b'meila zagin. So therefore this, in the simple pshat of the pasuk, forces us to say, as the Haisafe from Baal Shalish Riyos, Oiv Baal Shtei Riyos, that the difference between the zav with 2 riyos and the zav with 3 riyos is nit in them etzem inyan v'oifen atumah, tamehu. The difference between them is not regarding the actual tumah itself. That we see in the flow of the pasuk, that the tumah is the same, not in them. Rather, the difference is v'shtayim l'tumah. That with 2 riyos, it's over there's the halachas of tumah. V'hashlishis, and the third, maskikasoi l'karbon. The exact words of Rashi over here is, this will require a carbon. And here, the Rebbe is medayik, the words of Rashi, he says, maski kosai, this requires a carbon. Nit mechayvosai carbon. Rashi does not use the term that this obligates a carbon, rather maski kosai li carbon. This is something that will require a carbon. I'm not sure if I'm using the exact right translation for the word maski kosai, but let's see what the Rebbe says here. For zika meant, what does the term zika mean? Neutigkeit in a naye Seite gezach. What this means is that there's a necessity for something that's new, something that's different, separate of the category of tumah that we're speaking about. In other words, what Rashi's trying to stress over here is, as far as the tumah is concerned, and all the details of the halachas of the tumah that will be elaborated upon later in the parsha, that the halachas of the tumah of the shteiris and the tumah of the shalashis is the same. And you see it from what the pasuk says, tamehu, and then regarding the first type of zav, shtei riyos, and then it says right afterwards, v'zois tia tumasei, regarding the shalosh riyos, so that they have, the tumah has the same halacha. So it must be that the difference between them is in another point. That here, the tumah of the shalosh riyos is maskik, it necessitates a new thing, an inyan of a carbon. But the chiluk is not in the tumah itself. It necessitates a carbon which is a separate inyan. That's the source of where Rashi sees that not only the point that the Rebbe explained before, that the difference between the Baal Shtei Riyos and the Baal Shalish Riyos, that we divide them in 2 categories, is Mukhrach and Pshutah Shel Mikra from before, but we also see that the actual prat of what the difference between them is also Mukhrach and Pshutah Shel Mikra before. Rabbi says, move on. So with all of this we understand, was Rashi sagt b'siyam hasedra. Why Rashi here says that Baal Shtei Riyos or Baal Shalish Riyos she'teirasan mufureshes lamayla. That we have these 2 categories of the Shtei Riyos and the Shalish Riyos, and the difference between them and their halachas as well is all explicitly seen from the lashon of the pasuk earlier. Weil der chiluk anal zwischen Shtei Riyos und Shalish Riyos, because the difference, as explained before, between these 2 zavin of the 2 or 3 riyos is muchrech oich mitzat pshutai. Kanal barucha. It's clear from the lashonis of the psukim before, as explained at length, from the way it's divided, and on the other hand, the way the Torah says that regarding the tumah, it's the same, but there must be another difference, the carbon. B'meila, as Rashi will upteichen, velach zav is teirasa mifareshes lamayla. So here, when Rashi wants to say, when it says vazav ezayve and it's mifareshes lamayla, which zav is mifareshes lamayla? Did it say explicitly earlier? Nidvi bariya achas. Unlike this new zav that the Torah introduces here, the zav that had just had 1 riyah, was teirasa shteit esh b'siyam hasedre, which the Torah tells us for the first time only here. Brengt beide sugim in zav. So Rashi brings the two categories of Zav. When the Torah says Ve'azav Ezayve, which refers to what the Torah said earlier, so he brings both of the categories that are explicitly mentioned earlier. So the point of here is that the hechrich, the Rebbe goes back to the point that he said in the beginning, that the hechrich of Rashi to say that there's the shteiriyis and the shalishiyis is not from the language of the pasuk here, Vazav Ezayve. Rather, it's because Torah here is giving you the conclusion of what was written earlier, and earlier it mentioned the shteiriyis and shalishiyis, so therefore Rashi here brings back what the Torah mentioned before, the shteiriyis and the shalishiyis, and Rashi tells you, it's mufureshas l'mayla. It's clear, it's explicit from the language of the psukim before, as the Rabbi explained by Arichis, the division of the category of these two zavin, and also the way it's divided, what divides them. This is for tumah, this is for carbon. It's all understood from the simple pshat of the pasuk before. This is the conclusion of the explanation of this Rashi here in the simple pshat of how Rashi learns the psukim over here, the redundancy of the two types of zavin, the zav of riya achas, and then the zav of shtei riyais and shalish riyais. Here in the next part of the Sikha, the Rebbe will now take from what Rashi here says an idea that we can understand in the definition, in the geder of the zav baal shtei riyais. From the inyanim muflaim al derech ha'alacha in Pirish Rashi zeh. From the wondrous ideas, an expression that the Shlach Kodesh says that we can take from what Rashi says here in halacha, in the al derech ha'alacha, comparing to what Rashi says here regarding the zav baal shtei riyais to what it says in the Teiras Kainim. They're teichen from Pirish Rashi b'siyim hasedre. The same content of what Rashi here says in the end of the parsha steht in Teiras Kainim within pasuk. It also says it in the Teiras Kainim and the pasuk, nor mit kama shinuyim. In Teiras Kainim it says it with a few differences. Vi mefarshe Rashi shtalon zechavzei, and the commentaries, the commentators on Rashi already point out these differences. There is a certain difference in the language of the Teiras Kainim and the Rashi that the Rebbe says I haven't found as of yet that anybody should stop and explain. And we can say as in dem shini likt agansinyin, that in this difference of language that the Rebbe will point out here, there's a whole entire subject. On alishitase from Teiras Kainim alache ade pirish Rashi pshuta shel mikra. Two different approaches here between Rashi, and which is simple pshat of the pasuk, and the Teiras Kainim, of the way Rashi and Teiras Kainim explained this inyan earlier in the beginning of the parsha here, where it begins this whole subject, and then the way they explain it over here at the end when it says Zais Teiras in this part, in this conclusion here in the last pasuk of the parsha. Okay, so what is this seemingly slight difference in language, which opens up a whole subject here, the difference between Rashi and the Teiras Kainim? In Teiras Kainim is the lashon. The Teiras Kainim over here, when it divides in the categories of the zavin that the Torah concludes here with, so the lashon the Teiras Kainim says is zeh shara riya achas, the one that saw one discharge, or zeh shara shtei riya is the one that saw two, or zeh shara shalish riya is the one that saw three discharges. That's the language in the Teiras Kainim. On Rashi's Mishana, Rashi changes this language and Zakt, and instead Rashi says Baal Riya Achas, referring to the person, the one that saw one discharge, Baal Shtei Riyais, and the one that saw two, or Baal Shalish Riyais. The term Baal is dividing it with a much stronger division. That dividing it, he's the one that possesses, so to speak. He's the one that's in this category. He's this person, the other, and the third person. So Rashi makes a much bigger division between them. What is this? What's the reason why Rashi changed this language, and why is Rashi dividing it this way? So the Rebbe will give a long geschmacke explanation for this and come back then in the end to explain the difference. Rebbe does verstehen, behaktim will understand this by first introducing was wir gefind in Gemara zwei limudim auf dem chiluk von shtei riyos and shalish riyos. When we look in the Gemara brings actually two opinions for the source of where we learn this idea that there is a difference between the zav of two discharges and the zav of three. What's the source for this? So Aleph, the first is the drasha from Rab Simai, was Rashi bringt dort up, the drasha of Rab Simai, which is the one that Rashi says, Mana kosav shtayim v'karei tamei, that the Torah, as mentioned before in the first pasuk of the whole parsha, it says the term zav and zave twice. So therefore we know that it's talking about the zav of two discharges. And then shalish, in the next pasuk, it says the term zav and zayve three times, v'karei tamei, and there it says that he's tamei, so this is the three discharges. So ha-ketzat, what's the difference? Shtayim l'tumeh, with two discharges, there's halacha of tumeh that applies, and v'shalish, and then by three, there's halacha of l'karbon. that in addition you have to bring a carbon. This is the same as Rashi. But then there's another source, the drasha fundi chachamim. There's the drasha of the chachamim where they darshan the source for the zav bal shtei riyos and shalish riyos a bit differently. So they say as follows: Zayvai is chada. When the pasuk says the term zayvai, and this refers to the term zayvai, I believe in the second pasuk where it says the term zayvai, that's referring to one discharge. Then the pasuk says rar besarai, which is another term of a discharge, that the flesh, there's a discharge from the flesh today. That refers to a second discharge. And the Torah says again, es zayvai, after the term rar besarai, it continues and says es zayvai. So what is that? Plus. That refers to a third discharge. Limit al zav bal shalosh riyos shechayev b'karbon. That's the source for the zav with 3 discharges that has the full tumah, including also requiring a carbon. Then, what's the source of the zav for 2 riyos? So Chachamim say, when the pasuk there continues and says, Oy hechten b'sarai mi zayvai. So here the Torah uses that there's a flow, there's a discharge, hechten b'sarai mi zayvai. So here the Torah uses a term of mi zayvai from this flow, from this discharge. So what this means is tomei miktas. 1 second. So this is the lashon of the pasuk. Tomei. So he'll be tomei. So miktas zayvai. So when the Torah uses the term mi zayvai, the term mi means that he only has somewhat of the tumah of the zav that was mentioned before. What does this mean? Miktas zayvai tomei. A little bit of the zav that was mentioned before is the tumah that we're talking about now here. What that means is, limit al zav bal shtei riyos, it's teaching me that even if he doesn't have the full flow of the 3 discharges, even if he only had a miktas of it, 2, he's also going to be tamei, shemetame mishka v'maishav, the halachas of tumah, of where you lie and where you sit will apply. So, according to the Chachamim, the drasha comes from the term mi zayvai. Oy hechten b'sarei mi zayvai tamei, miktas zayvai timei. So that's because it uses the term mi. So we see that even if you didn't have all 3 discharges, even 2 is also going to be tamei. Okay, so now the Rebbe says, "V'yeshleimar asazanaf geminetz vishen ditzvei limudim." There is a difference in the source here, where the Simai learns it, and the way the Chachamim darshan this in the Geder von Azav bal shtei riyos, how we define the tumah of the zav that had just 2 discharges. This could be explained in one of 2 ways. Aleph, either we can say zav bal shtei riyos, v'zav bal shalosh riyos, zenen zwei in ganzen besondere metziasen. Well, 2 discharges and 3 discharges is 2 completely different things. Die tumah von bal shtei riyos is nicht dieselbe tumah von die shtei riyos von dem bal shalosh riyos. It's not the same tumah of the zav that had 3 discharges. It's not a 2/3 of the tumah of the one that had 3 discharges. It's a tumah for itself. Die zwei riyos mitzad atzmam zene mechayev tumah zav v'sfira zayin. When you have 2 discharges, this itself obligates it brings tumah, and you count the 7 days of purity to become pure after 7 days. That's one way to understand this. Beis, however, another way to understand this is the tumah from Baal Shtei Riyos, the tumah of the one that had 2 discharges, is a chelek from the tumah from Azav Baal Shtei Shalosh Riyos. What does his tumah consist of? It's a certain portion or a certain percent of the real tumah or the ultimate tumah, which is by the Shalosh Riyos. And the one that has Shtei Riyos is 2/3 of that, and therefore he has tumah. Is a chelek from Shalosh Riyos. So since he experienced 2 discharges, which is a portion of the 3, so therefore he also will be tamei to a certain extent, similar to the Baal Shalosh Riyos, but not completely, not on the level of the Baal Shalosh Riyos that would have to bring a carbon as well. So the Baal Shtei Riyos is just a percent, it's a portion, it's 2/3 of the Baal Shalosh Riyos, but it's not really a tumah or a metzias of tumah for itself. According to this second approach, the Rebbe says, "Al pizek kem mevai zayin, was steht in Targum Yonasan ben Azil auf dem pasuk ish ki yeh zav geimer." The Targum Yonasan, right in the beginning, on the first pasuk where it talks about the halacha of the zav, so the Targum Yonasan says, "Chama tlas zimni." He saw 3 discharges. Und der Matnit klar wegen dem Dim from Baal Shalish Teirius. And he skips, he doesn't mention at all the fact that the Teirius is really also talking about the Zav that only had 2 Riyas. Why? Because the Tumah from Baal Teirius is a Chelek from Baal Shalish Riyas. Because Targum Yonasan is saying the main Tumah, which is one Metzias of Tumah. The Zav that had 3 discharges. The Baal Teirius is a detail and a percent of that. So therefore he doesn't elaborate, he doesn't spell it out. But it's really all one Tumah of Shalish Riyas. Those are the 2 approaches we can say regarding the Baal Shteiriyos. Eine von den Afgemines, was wir können sagen mit der Chefshel halacha b'poil, and an actual difference between them that we could say that applies in halacha b'poil between these 2 approaches, we can say as follows: Oibis is given a hefsik yoim zwischen der dritte Riye und die erste zwei Riyes. If there's an interruption of a day between the first 2 discharges and then the 3rd discharge. So now the question would be, do I say that even though there was an interruption of a day, I combine all 3, and therefore he's considered now to be a Zav that has 3 discharges, and therefore he has to bring a carbon, or the nit, or because there was an interruption of a day, so we have the Zav of 2 riyas, and then he'll be Tomei, but it doesn't require a carbon, and then he saw 1 more riyah, which is separate. So it doesn't require a carbon. But das is a plukte. Now this question here, it's actually an argument of Tanoim. The Das Rabbi Eliezer ben Yehuda, it's Beishamai and Beisilel. Beishamai and Beisilel argue about this. So this machlokes of Beishamai and Beisilel could be explained that they're arguing in the gather of how we define the Zav Baal Shteiriyos. And the Rebbe explains, if we're going to accept and explain, as Thomas Baal Shteiriyos is aniyim b'fnei atzmai. The tumah of the one that saw 2 discharges is a tumah for itself. Heistes, what this means is, as noch die 2 riyas, as soon as he has these 2 discharges, wird gleich achiyuv mitzad atzmai zu zählen zayin akim. So immediately, this requires him, the tumah applies, and the tumah applies for 7 days, and he has to count 7 clean days to become pure. Seidin, oib mizet gleich hadit riyah, unless he immediately afterwards sees a 3rd discharge, is the Gloi Milsa. So then what this reveals is, as that is a Baal Shalish Riyos, that he's not the category of the Shtei Riyos, he's rather a different Tumah, the Tumah of Shalish Riyos, then the Halach of the carbon applies. But before you get to the Shalish Riyos, as soon as he sees Shtei Riyos, there is a category of Tumah for itself that necessitates right away the Tumah and the counting of 7 clean days. Well, if this is the approach, it should come out as follows. As Oibis is given noch die 2 riyas, I have sekyoim, if after he saw these 2 discharges, there was an interruption of a day, says nisbare geworden, as there is nit kein Baal Shalish Riyas. So if there's interruption of a day, so now it's clear that he's not the Zav that has 3 discharges. Is he gloi milses? So now it's clear, as hat gleich noch die zweite Riyah dem din von a Baal Shtei Riyas. So now, once there's interruption of 1 day where there was no discharge, now it becomes clear, what is this person? He's a person with just 2 riyas. So now, if after this became clear to us already, and after that interruption of a day, he sees again another discharge, is das anayin? That's counted and considered to be something new. As wird nit staref to the friedige 2 riyas. We don't combine it to the previous 2 discharges that were already defined as something separate. That's one approach. So then he would not have to bring a carbon. He's a Baal Shtei riyas plus another one, but we don't combine them together to be 3. That's all based on the approach that the Baal Shtei riyas is a ein b'fnei atzmai. So therefore, right after the Shtei riyas and there's an interruption, we divide it and define it as Baal Shtei riyas, and that's it. Oi, but the Tumah from Baal Shtei Riyos is a Chelek in them gather from Tumah's Baal Shalish Riyos. If the Tumah of the Baal Shtei Riyos is really just a portion of, a certain percent of the full Tumah of the Shalish Riyos, of the 3 discharges, that face comes, so then has to come out, as a filler nach dem, this is durchgegangen, ein Tag von die Zayin Akim. Even if there were 2 Riyos. And then he begins counting clean days, and there's an interruption of a day with no Riyah. And it's after 1 day of the 7 clean days, noch die 2 riyas, after he had the 2 discharges. But then, after this interruption of a day, he sees a 3rd discharge. So that 3rd riyah is started to the friedige 2. It will be combined to the previous 2. Weil die Sfira Zayin Ikim noch 2 riyas, because even the 2 riyas that were in the beginning, And he began counting the Zayin Ekim, which is required after 2 Riyas. Why is that? It's not really these 2 Riyas in itself is a separate category of Tumah that necessitates this. Rather, the only reason you're required to count 7 days is because it's a portion, it's a percent of the Shalish Riyas. So if, when you're counting, you have that 3rd Riyah, that's the completion of the 2 Riyas that happened before. So then we will combine them together, and he'll be a Zav Bal Shalish Riyas, which will be Chayiv and a carbon. That's the practical difference between the 2 approaches regarding the Zav Bal Shtei Riyas. So now, with these 2 approaches, the Rebbe comes back to explain the difference between Rashi and the Teiras Kainim. And here we'll see what Rashi and the Teiras Kainim say, and how the source of the Bal Shtei Riyas and Bal Shalish Riyas, where they're darshan from in the beginning, in the Parsha, and how they explain also in their Lashon that they say in the end of the Parsha. This is the difference between the 2 sources mentioned before. Well, what does the term mizayve mean? If we're going to say that the whole source of the zav that had just 2 riyas comes from the expression of the pasuk mi zayve, it's somewhat of the full zav of 3 riyas. So then it's clear that what is the definition of this zav of shtei riyas? He's the zav that has somewhat of the full the tumah of 3 riyas. So then he's not a tumah of a category for himself. He's just a certain percent of the shalish riyas. However, according to Rabbi Simoi's Rasha, Mona Kosev Shtayim Chulu, that we learn it from one pasuk where the Torah says 2, and then another pasuk where the Torah says 3. The Torah Rechen Shtayim Bazunde, so the Torah is counting 2 that is separately in one pasuk, on Shalish Bazunde, and the Zav of 3 Riyas separately. On in 2 Bazunde Psukim, and they're in different Psukim altogether. Then there's 2 Bazunde Sugim and Zav. It's 2 completely different categories of a Zav that have nothing to do with each other. With this, we understand the difference in the way, the language, the way Rashi and the Teiras Kainim say here in the end of the Parsha. And they go to Shitasai in the source of the drasha of the Bal Shtei Riyas. The Teiras Kainim bringt früher herab dem Limud Mizayvai Mikza Zayvai. The Teiras Kainim darshans like the Chachamim that the source is from the term Mizayvai, that the Bal Shtei Riyas is a portion, it's somewhat of the Zav of the Shalish Riyas. On the far, so therefore over here in the end of the Parsha, when the Torah concludes everything, Zakta Dadam Lashon, so over here it uses the expression of Zeh Shara Shtei Riyas. This one saw 2 discharges, Shalish Riyas saw 3 discharges. What does this mean? The Lashon is Madgish, the Riyas B'Payil. He uses, the Teiras Kainim uses an expression just referencing the actual discharges themselves. Why? So is that in themselves together? Because what you understand from this language is that really the person himself, which is Tumah, the actual Tumah itself is the same idea of Tumah. Because the Baal Shtei Riyas is just a percent of the Tumah of the Baal Shalish Riyas. It's one din of Tumah really. It says not Achiluk in Kamos, Vifel Riyas is then a Shoin Geven. The only difference between them is the Baal Shalish Riyas saw all the discharges that bring the full Tumah, and the Baal Shtei Riyas only saw at this point just 2, and therefore he begins counting Zayin Ekim at that percent. But if we'll see more afterwards, it will combine to what was before. So the term of Zeh Shara is referring to what did he already actually see, but not that it's 2 different categories altogether. So this is the Teiras Kainim L'Shitasa in the source of what he brings in the beginning, Mi Zayvai, Mikza Zayvai. Rashi, however, when it comes to Rashi, Rashi learns it as Rabbi Simoi learns that it's 2 different psukim, divides it in 2 different categories. Halt, that doesn't in Bazundere mention a Bazundere Baal Shara. 2 different people that's divided into 2 different categories. Different person with a different experience of Tumah, and they're not related to each other. One is not, the Baal Shtei Riyas is not a percent or a portion of the Baal Shalish Riyas. The far is medayik umefaret b'lashonis. So therefore, Rashi is very precise, and Rashi elaborates and says in his lashon and changes from the Teiras Kainim. Baal Riyah Achas. There's the individual that saw 1 discharge. Then there's the Baal Shtei Riyas, the individual that saw 2 discharges, or Baal Shalish Riyas, and the one that saw 3. It's different categories, or really 3 categories. Yeah, difference is a Bazunde Baal La'atzma. Each one of them is a different category of Tumah for itself, with an actual nafkamina b'payil in this, as the Rebbe explained before.